Hi, I'm Laurel Perkins, and I'm going to be talking about how grammars grow. So here's how linguistic theory has traditionally modeled language acquisition. Children take their primary linguistic data, which are sentences produced by others in their community, and they use that data in combination with their linguistic knowledge and the rest of their cognition in order to infer the grammar of their language, which allows them to assign structure and meaning to those sentences. But like any model, we know that this one's an abstraction. And one thing it abstracts away from is development, which is how learning takes place in incremental steps. So for example, this is Susie at 2 months of age. She's listening to her mom ask this question, and she applies her existing grammatical knowledge to try to parse it. And maybe at this age, she comes up with something like this, the acoustics of the sounds that her mom is producing. She then has to use this representation of her input, plus her linguistic and cognitive abilities, to learn more things about her grammar. And then that process iterates, and that new knowledge allows her to parse her input in new ways. So maybe at 9 months, she can identify some familiar words, and then maybe some structure, until finally she has enough grammatical knowledge to assign a full parse to the sentence. But because this process is so incremental, you might wonder, how does it get off the ground, and how does it end up in the right place? And so I'm arguing that the answer to these two questions is going to tell us more about two types of resources that are crucial to this learning process. Children need resources for representing their input in useful ways for future learning, even before they've acquired the target grammar. And they need resources for learning from these input representations, even when they're incomplete and immature. And I'm looking at this using the case study of argument structure, how verbs occur with subjects and objects in a clause. I'm first asking about the resources that young infants have for representing these clause arguments at the age when they're learning verbs, whether they only represent the number of arguments in a sentence or whether they differentiate those in some manner as subjects and objects. And then I'm asking what happens when learners have to recognize clause arguments in sentences like this WH question, where the WH word but acts as the object of the verb at a distance. And I'll show that infants learn these non-local dependencies early in infancy, but there's an earlier stage of development where the representations are incomplete. And I'll ask what resources could enable learning from incomplete representations. So let's get started. By this age, at 20 months, infants are using the transitivity of a clause to draw inferences about the meanings of new verbs. So when they hear a new verb in a clause with a subject and an object, like the girl pinned the truck, they'll prefer to look at a causal event over a non-causal one. And one popular proposal says that this inference is working in the following way. Susie here identifies that the sentence has two noun phrase arguments, the girl and the truck, but at this age, she doesn't differentiate them as subject or object. She just represents that there are two of them, and she expects those two arguments to match one-to-one to the participants that she perceives in an event. So a pimming must be an event that she sees as having exactly two participants. But suppose she's using a more sophisticated strategy. Maybe she doesn't merely represent that the sentence has two arguments, but she moreover differentiates their grammatical relations in some way. She represents the girl as subject and the truck as object. And suppose, moreover, that she knows how grammatical relations link to particular thematic relations, that transitive subjects name agents and objects name patients. This would tell her that a pimming must be an event that she sees as having an agent and a patient. So it turns out that both of these hypotheses can account for prior data because both of these strategies would lead Susie to look more at a causal event over a non-causal event when she hears a sentence. So we experimentally differentiated these two hypotheses using a test case where they make different predictions. So here's the test case. This is a scene that you would plausibly see as a taking with three participant roles. There's an agent of taking, the girl, a patient being taken, the truck, and some source or victim, the boy. And in prior work, we established that infants also readily see the scene as having three participants. In this study, we then familiarized infants to the scene described as the girl pinned the truck. And we then asked what they think pimmings are. Well, as an adult, you might think that we're talking about the whole three-participant taking because it's fine to talk about takings without mentioning the source. And the child who's primarily paying attention to thematic content rather than the number of the arguments in the clause would probably draw the same conclusion. So thematic linking would tell her to look for an event which has the girl as agent and the truck as patient. And if she readily represents the scene as a taking with these roles, then she'd probably conclude that pimmings are takings. The sentence wouldn't give her reason to think otherwise. But a child using the number matching strategy would reach a different conclusion. So this two-argument sentence would tell her to find a two-participant event concept. That means she'd have to zoom in on just the part of the event that involves the girl and the truck. So this sentence isn't about the whole three-participant taking. It must be describing just the girl's grabbing of the truck, independent of the boy. And so at test, infants were asked to find another instance of pimming while seeing two side-by-side videos. One was another video of taking at the top. In the second video, which is here at the bottom, the girl grabs the truck without the boy present. So if infants think pimmings are three-participant takings, they should prefer the top video. And if they think they're grabbings, they shouldn't show a preference because the girl is grabbing the truck in both videos. It turns out that 20-month-olds do show an above baseline preference for the taking video at test. And so this tells us that they allow a clause with two arguments to describe an event that they represent with three participants. They don't think that it must describe a two-participant event. So they're not matching arguments to participants one-to-one. This behavior is more consistent with the predictions of the thematic linking hypothesis. We controlled for the possibility that this was just a bias for the familiar video by running a second experiment with a different familiarization sentence, the truck is pimming. Both hypotheses say that this really shouldn't be a good description of a three-participant taking, and it turns out that infants agree. They no longer prefer the familiar taking video at test. So this means that they're paying attention to the familiarization sentence when they're hearing this new verb. They think that a transitive clause can link in the right way to their taking representation, but this intransitive clause can't. So this tells us something about the resources that infants have for representing clause arguments early in development. They're not merely paying attention to the number of arguments and expecting them to match one-to-one to perceived event participants. Instead, their behavior suggests that they're more flexibly linking specific argument relations to participant relations. And this implies something interesting about their clause representations. They're looking to differentiate subjects and objects in sentences that they hear, and in a format that allows for adult-like inferences about meaning. But they don't only need to find local subjects and objects, they also need to find non-local ones, like in this WH question. So this brings us to our question about learning. How do they identify argument movement in these sentences, and how does this process interact with their verb learning? So here's what I mean by that. These WH questions in 1 don't have an object after the verb, but they're actually transitive, like the sentences in 2. The WH word but acts as the object via a non-local dependency. But suppose Susie hasn't yet learned which words are WH words in her language, so she doesn't know that this dependency is present. She might think that these sentences only have a subject and no object, like the intransitive sentences in 3. And this would maybe lead her to think that bring is the kind of verb that can freely drop its object, whereas it actually can't. So this is a kind of chicken and egg problem. If Susie knew that arguments had been moved in these questions, that would help her learn verb argument structure. Or if she knew that bring requires a direct object, that might help her figure out that the object has been moved. So what comes first, argument structure or argument movement? We answered this question with a task where we played infants groups of sentences and measured how long they listened to them. In one condition, they heard sentences like these ones. These are declaratives with transitive verbs with and without objects. If infants know the argument structure of these verbs, then they should share our intuitions that the sentences with objects are better than the sentences without, and this will be reflected in their listening preferences in some way. They might listen longer to the acceptable sentences or to the surprising ones at any given age. Meanwhile, a second group of infants hears WH questions like these ones in yellow. So notice here that the acceptability pattern flips for these sentences. It's no longer grammatical in English to have an object after the verb because the WH phrase is acting as that object non-locally. But suppose infants don't know this and they're only paying attention to the local subjects and objects. From their perspective, there's a needed object after the verb in the top sentence, but missing in the bottom sentence. So the top sentence is more acceptable. And so their listening preferences are going to go in the same direction as the infants who heard declaratives. There's not going to be a difference between these two sentence types. Their preferences aren't going to flip until they represent the WH phrase as an object and then realize that the top question has too many arguments. So we're looking for opposite listening preference patterns in declaratives versus WH questions as evidence that infants represent both local and non-local relations. And this is exactly what we found for 18-month-olds. Infants who heard declaratives in blue listened longer to sentences with objects after the verb, and infants who heard WH questions in yellow listened longer to sentences without. So that is, they're listening longer to grammatical sentences of each type. And this tells us that even at this very young age, they're representing the WH phrase as an object. They're representing this non-local dependency. 15-month-olds don't do this. Instead, they listen longer to all the sentences without objects after the verb, regardless of sentence type. So this suggests that they know something about the transitivity of these verbs. They care when the object is locally missing, and at this age, that makes them listen longer. But they don't differentiate between an object that's missing because there's a WH phrase and an object that's just simply missing. So they seem to be unaware that WH phrases act as objects non-locally in these questions. And so this is the answer to the chicken and egg question. There's some argument structure knowledge that seems to be in place by 15 months, but infants don't recognize argument movement in WH questions until 18 months. What I'd like to conclude with today is a brief discussion of how that's possible. How could 15-month-old Susie learn verb argument structure before she can recognize moved arguments? That is, why don't the WH questions and other kinds of movement in our input lead her to think that all verbs are equally fine with or without direct objects, but she's only working from partial sentence representations? The previous literature said, here's how this works. Very young learners somehow filter their input, so they're learning only from basic clauses like these ones, where arguments haven't been moved. And these proposals assumed that learners had some way to identify these clauses as, or not these clauses, but the other ones as non-basic in order to filter them. That Susie can hear this question and say, oh, that's a non-basic clause, let me ignore it. But this is somewhat circular. And so we're proposing a new solution. Maybe Susie doesn't need to filter non-basic clauses per se. She just needs to filter her data in a way that's going to allow her to separate out the signal from the noise. Our model implicitly expects that its data will have some noise, and it uses the distributions of local direct objects to jointly learn both verb transitivity, as well as how much signal versus noise is present. And crucially, it doesn't know why there's noise. It doesn't know ahead of time which sentences are WH questions or other non-basic clauses. It just finds a filter that lets it best explain how verbs are distributing with the arguments that it can recognize. And when we tested it on child-directed speech, it wasn't perfect, but it assigned the majority of verbs to the correct transitivity category. And so this provides a solution to the chicken and egg problem. Strategic filtering might let Susie identify verb argument structure before she can recognize moved arguments. And this is a potentially powerful tool for learning more generally. Learners might be able to clean up messy data that comes from immature representations without knowing why it's messy. But we'd also like to know how the rest of this process goes, how Susie by 18 months goes from this immature representation to a fuller representation of the WH dependency in this question. And so what we're proposing is that learners are motivated by a general drive to identify the core argument relations in a clause. They're looking for relations like subject and object. And if they can identify these locally, that gives them helpful information for finding the non-local ones. We're calling this gap-driven learning, and it works in the following way. So first, Susie here learns that some verbs require certain arguments. So for instance, bring needs an object. And that's going to help her notice when expected arguments are locally missing. So just like the 15-month-olds in our study, she'll detect the object gap in this WH question. And then she might ask, what surface forms are correlated with unexpectedly missing arguments? So she might notice that this happens a lot of the time in questions, and particularly in questions with function words like what and do, until finally she's in a position where she can explain these correlations as different types of grammatical dependencies. So that is, she needs to go from observing a correlation between this function word and the missing direct object to representing that function word as that object because it's in a WH dependency with the verb. Our filter model provides a starting place for this learning story, a way for this first step to take place before all of the other ones. And we've also instantiated a model that performs the second step of learning. So this model performs a smart kind of distributional analysis using the verb transitivity knowledge that the first model had learned to identify the surface forms that co-occur with object gaps in child-directed speech. And this allowed it to identify most sentences with object movement in its data. So it's in principle possible for Susie to identify the surface forms that characterize movement in English when guided by knowledge of argument structure. But this model still hasn't performed this last step of learning, figuring out not just that some surface forms are correlated with each other, but explaining these correlations as particular types of dependencies. Susie has to identify that the function word what is in a WH dependency versus some other movement or non-movement relation. And we don't have a good answer yet for how she does this, but it's likely that she'll need to be guided by some knowledge about the types of dependencies that might be present in any given sentence, and what consequences those dependencies would have on the surface form of that sentence. So to sum up, this has been an in-depth look at just one small corner of syntax development in English, but it provides a starting place for tackling a much bigger question, which is understanding the role of development in grammar acquisition as a whole. What resources do children bring to this task of incrementally learning from their input, building on partial grammatical knowledge one step at a time? And today I showed that infants differentiate the grammatical and thematic relations of arguments in a clause, and this tells us something about the representational resources. They might be hunting for subjects and objects in sentences that they hear. And it takes time for them to identify non-local argument relations in their input. In order to do this, They might have to be smart about what data to learn from and use their prior syntactic knowledge to guide statistical learning. And this tells us something about the resources that children have from learning from input representations that are incomplete and immature. And I've also shown that we have the tools for answering these questions. We can combine behavioral measures of learners' knowledge with computational models of their learning. And it's likely that this process will generalize to other domains of language acquisition and also other domains of learning beyond language. We can apply these same tools to understand how learners in any domain are combining prior knowledge with learning resources in order to draw the right generalizations from developing representations of their data. Thank you.